Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I have one change order to report this month, and that's on the Aurora Reservoir Pump Station Security and Aeration Panels project. And this change order is of almost $50,000 on a $200,000 PO. So it represents um, about 20%, 23% of the original PO amount. Now, this project has a little bit of history. A little bit of background on this is that the original upgrades project was actually $14 million. Then COVID hit, and so we had to kind of redirect the project and basically pay out that original PO on the work we had done. So we still had $1.5 million on that PO. So we closed out the work and then started up another PO to do these security improvements and the control panels. And these were the items that were actually subject to all the supply chain issues and the long lead items and stuff like that. So this 200,000 actually would have been absorbed in the original contract, except that we had pieced them out during COVID. So this 48,000 that is this change order really just represents uh, all the supply chain issues that we had with the electronics that are required for this project.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on this change order?
The only thing I would say is I'm really wishing the supply chain issues would go away.
Mhm.
Us
All
too.
right, well,
All of us.
Yes.
thank you, Sriman.
Thank you.
I think we're just gonna start calling this the John Murphy Water Supply Update.
Well, good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm John Murphy, Water Resources Project Manager in the Water Resources Group. And you have in your packet water supply update that we produce on a monthly basis. Problem is with the scheduling of the meetings, we're always kind of 2 weeks after the fact, right? So this one took us through the end of December, which is nice because it wrapped up the whole year for us. But a few things have changed. Notably, we got some snow in the last week or so, and so the percentages that are on the SNOTEL graphs in your packet, I think they're on page, let's see, 11 of 31 in the packet, starting there. Those don't look very nice, but it's still way early in the season, but we did get a nice little bump from that last storm. And it looks like we might see a little bit more snow up in the mountains, maybe over the next 24 hours. But we're more in the range of, for the South Platte Basin, at least for the SNOTEL sites that yield into our system area. We're more at 87% of average for South Platte, 83% of average for the Arkansas, and 103% of average for the Colorado Basin. Now, as I said, that's still very early, but it's always nicer to see those graphs get a bump like that. Other than that, things are really just chugging along, normal winter operations. We're holding steady around that 77, 78% of storage. I will draw your attention once again. I mentioned this last month. That storage, our total storage, does include some water that we are essentially borrowing from Denver because of some projects that are going on the South Platte River up top, the Lake George Dam Removal Project. Limits our release from Spinney Mountain Reservoir to 60 CFS. So we're not able to release as much water as we normally would this time of year to fill Aurora Reservoir and meet demand. Plus, we have our own project going on the Rampart Pipeline, a slip lining project that's would limit what we can bring down to the city anyhow. But the result of that is we're basically borrowing from Denver some water at Strontia to meet our demands well, we haven't been borrowing much lately, but early on in the project, early this fall, we had a chunk, and it amounts to about 4,100 acre feet of water that we have in Spinney Mountain Reservoir that we will release this spring when the project is complete. So that's a long-winded way of saying the storage amounts that you're seeing in the report are a little elevated from where they would be by about 4,000 acre feet. So happy to talk to anybody offline if you have questions or you want to do a deeper dive into any of that. But either way, we're in a much better position this year than we have been in previous years for this time of year. So there you go. Any questions? I'd be happy to talk about it.
Questions for John?
Just one, and I'm happy. I saw the forecast last night. It looks like a lot of snow for the mountains, which is great. On your back, in the backup on your chart, you at the end you have the WISE supply, and how much we're basically releasing, and then I know it doesn't. I don't think it has the money connotation to it, but can you just give a quick update on WISE?
Sure. So that looks like it's on page 15 of 31 in the packet. There's a graph there that show the calendar year to date deliveries to the WISE project. So the WISE year is June 1st through May 31st, just because we need another year to think about, not a calendar year or a water year, but now we have a WISE year, but the bookends on that contract are June 1st to May 31st. And so we are delivering less water to them this WISE year than we have in the past, primarily because Denver Water is unable to supply any blend water from the mountain system anymore because of their agreement with the West Slope. And until we get infrastructure built for their connection to their potable system out at DIA, we won't see any more blend supply from Denver. So we're delivering them, I think it's 1,000, a little over 1,000 acre feet this WISE year, June 1st through May 31st. So that's why you're seeing that graph have a very flat. There's a couple blips on it because they asked us for a little bit of water for a couple days, for a couple weekends back in earlier this winter. But that's what we're delivering to them right now is like 1 million gallons a day, just because that's where we're at. We'll reevaluate that and we'll be delivering them probably a greater amount of water when the year resets June 1st, 24 here.
So whatever water comes from WISE goes to Denver, and then they use it wherever. We don't have other partners besides Denver that we supply WISE.
No, so the WISE agreement is a Denver Aurora source water. So half of the water supply that goes to the WISE partners, Castle Rock, Parker, all those entities, half of the raw water comes from Aurora and half comes from Denver.
Okay.
So right now there's a challenge. Denver and South Metro, the WISE partners, had an agreement to build a connection up north that called the DIA connection that would allow Denver to get their water into our system. So Prairie Waters manages all of the water supply. We manage all of that water, but we're dependent upon Denver for half of the volume of water coming into the system. Without the DIA connection, Denver Water can't really provide the entirety of their half of that supply. Additionally, without the connections in place, and with the low water year, some of those other things kind of went into consideration when we set the delivery down at the 1,000 acre feet this year. for the water year, which, as John mentioned, resets June 1st. So then we are planning on ramping it up, but it still won't be the full delivery, the 10,000 acre feet that is anticipated until that DIA connection gets completed, which is finally, we think, getting started.
Okay.
But that'll be probably, what's the latest on that? 2 years out still?
So the infrastructure is planned to be finished by June 1, 2025. And we have built in a buffer in case.
A ramp up period. Yeah. So we won't have the DIA connection until mid 2025. You probably heard that. And then after that, we need a little bit of a ramp up period to test the higher flows, make sure everything's working in our system with the Denver supply coming in, et cetera. So there's another, I think, 9-month ramp up period before we hit full deliveries. So we're probably looking at 2026 before there are full deliveries as contemplated in the agreement.
Okay. And maybe sometime this year, a more overview of WISE would be good.
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah, we can bring an
With
update.
our new member.
Yeah, for sure. We can schedule that later this year. Maybe when we reset after June and have the delivery agreements for the next water year, we'll bring an update of the system, how it's working, where everything is in a few months to the committee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
You're welcome.
It looks as if we have an outdated drainage criteria manual that Sarah will touch on here.
Not anymore, which is
No?
nice. So, yeah, I'm gonna start with a map that actually wasn't in the presentation, but I thought it might make sense to just take a pretty big step back to explain at a higher level what our drainage criteria manual is for, and then we'll get into the updates. But this map, which has a lot of information in it, but we're really going to be looking at it from a big picture to start. So this basically shows our stormwater system across the city of Aurora. What you're seeing that's kind of the darker shaded areas are the city boundaries. And then the different colors are the major stormwater basins that cross our city. So the kind of intent of this, it basically shows the network that is our stormwater system. And one of the major roles of Mile High Flood District that you guys are both aware of, though they do a lot of different things now, is to make sure that this system functions from outside everyone's agency through other agencies, to make sure that it all works together well, right? And one of the major parts of that is the stormwater systems have been in place, forever. So long before we had any development in these spaces. And what everybody tries to do is tries to mimic when they're coming outside of boundaries, whether that's a developer's boundary or a municipal boundary, that we're trying to mimic nature before development as much as possible so that we're not damaging downstream properties, infrastructure, roadways, things like that. That is the main purpose of the district and why it was formed. That we're all kind of playing by the same rules and keeping all those things into account. So when we look at the system, so this is our network, if we, on a very high level, right? So we have to understand it on this big level. And then when you zoom into a particular area, if I can zoom into a particular area, I guess I can't do that and share at the same time. Well, anyway, I'll describe it. So let's just say where this hand is right here. So that is basically a quarter section or a mile. And if you can picture it, all these little orange lines are the pipe network. And then if you also think about it, the streets also act as stormwater conveyance. So those are also part of the network. So the more you zoom into it, the more complex the network gets, but it all has to function together in order for us to safely convey stormwater through the jurisdiction. And so the foundational reason for our drainage criteria manual is to make sure that at a very high level, the network is working, and at a very specific site level, the network is working, and that we're not flooding properties or putting people in danger. That's the whole goal of the criteria manual. So let me head into the presentation. And Greg, do I have to start the presentation before sharing it? Is that how that works?
Typically, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do that. I might not be smart enough, so we'll just do it this way instead. All right, so we'll go through it this way, but I think we'll be able to still see everything. I wonder if this will work.
Yep, it should.
Okay, great. So yeah, as you had mentioned, Councilmember Sundberg, so the last manual update was in 2010. There's a lot of things that have changed in a lot of areas in the last 14 years. We're very thankful that before the drainage team was transitioned from Public Works over to Aurora Water a couple of years ago, they had actually kicked off starting this drainage criteria manual update. So when they came to us, they also came with this project in its infancy. So that was excellent. The goals for updating the manual, there's a couple of things. Obviously, there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 14 years. A couple of those being just how the stormwater industry functions, right? So it used to be put stormwater under the ground, get rid of it as fast as you can, send it to wherever you can send it, and try not to pay attention to it. And there have been a lot of consequences of that. And so the industry has changed in terms of how can we slow that stormwater down? How can we get it to go across pervious surfaces first? What do more natural stream corridors look like so that they're not so expensive to maintain in the long term? There's just a lot of things that have been learned. There's also been really significant changes in the types of development, right? If you think about some of those residential properties in the 80s that had huge front yards, huge backyards, big lots, and now we've got these tiny lots with more hard surfaces crammed into smaller areas. Those things have changed too. So we need to understand the new math, basically, of how much water is running off of areas, how much we need to capture so that it acts like historic, and then how big the areas are that we need to be reserving for it to make sure that the system is working. The other main goal of it is the old criteria manual is a lot of words. Kind of like I talk like a lot of words, but it's just a lot. It was just verbiage. And that's hard. I mean, you have to read the whole thing a few times to really understand it. So we try to transition it into more tables, more examples, just more things that are easier for people who have been in the industry a long time or are brand new to the industry to be able to understand. We've been communicating with the development community from day one, and the engineering community. We basically sent out an email blast to everyone who has done any development in the city of Aurora or submitted applications in the last couple of years to kick off the engagement to say, hey, we're updating the criteria manual. Here's where the website's located. You can sign up for information. We got a lot of feedback from the engineers who work in our community and work for the developers throughout the process, which we were very thankful for. And we officially published the final manual last November, so just a couple months ago. I'm definitely not going to go through all of these, but a couple of these things that I wanted to touch on, but these are the different chapters that are associated in the manual. The submittal requirements, I just want to touch on briefly. So the map that we just looked at is the entire city. And we do master planning with the district, as you're aware of, the MDPs that we bring for the IGAs to evaluate big drainage areas. Each developer has different stages that they run through when they're bringing development into the city. So the master plan, basically their huge area in the context of their individual development. And that we need to understand the system, how it fits together with our broader system. Where does the water come into the site? Where does the water leave the site? How big do the channels need to be in that site to account for the amount of flow? How much detention do they have to put to make sure that we are acting like history and not sending more water downstream than before they developed? So that master plan stage is the big picture schematic concept. And so each of the submittal requirements basically go through, here's the information you have to provide at that point in time in order for us to ensure you're following the requirements. The next step is, okay, now you've got an individual home builder site, say, or a commercial site. Now, what do you have to do for water quality? Where is that going to go? Generally, where does overflow go if the pond were to overflow over a bigger storm event? How big do culverts need to be for roadway crossings? So you start dialing in the amount of information at the site planning stage. And then the civil stage, it's like, here's all the information. Here's how big the pipe is going to be, how deep it's going to be, where the inlets are. It's the information required to go build the stuff. And so the submittal requirements basically steps through in a checklist format all the documents that are required to make sure that they are providing us a complete package so that when we can review that information on the first round of review, we have a really good place to start. So that chapter was actually really crucial to make sure that we're all on the same page and their review can go efficiently through the system. So that one was really key. We'll talk a little bit about the stormwater drain policy at the end, because that talks about how we're applying the policy with everything that's in progress. Floodplain regulations, pretty straightforward. We'll talk about the hydrologic criteria. This is one you likely have heard a lot about, or if you haven't, will. The street inlet storm drains. Again, this is the small network that we talked about on the lower level. Open channels, hydraulic structures. Hydraulic structures are basically kind of the hardened infrastructure, the conveyance, capacity of the structures on the ground. Detention we'll talk a little bit more about, and then the others are kind of the more technical information. So all of these different things needed a refresh for sure. So detention. Oh, and I did want to step back really quick. So the hydrologic criteria, one thing to keep in mind here is that there's a national graph, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency Association, something, NOAA, whatever that acronym is. They basically develop a rainfall map for the country and they update those. And so our rainfall estimates are based on information that is updated, and they just updated that a couple of years ago. So that is also foundationally changed in terms of the amount of water that's falling for different frequency of storm events. So that's also something to just keep in mind. Okay, so detention. So this is something that you probably didn't hear about, but I think it is important to understand. So when we started looking at the criteria early on, we realized that we were more conservative than any of our partners in the district when it came to detention. What we had been requiring was the water quality capture volume, which is basically the water sits in there so that the sediment and things can fall out and we can capture that before it continues downstream for increased water quality. And then on top of that, we're including EURV, which is basically, so EURV is urban excess runoff. And what that is in nature, when rain used to fall, we didn't used to get runoff events often. But now we get them with small storm events because of how many hard surfaces we have. So we need to account for that and capture that too. And then the detention volume on top of that. So we were saying, okay, you need this, and then on top of that, you need this, and on top of that, you need this. So most of the other partners in the district agency nest those. So they allow you to say, you can count for those within your water quality detention. So basically, we're requiring less overall detention. And in addition to that, we had been asking for, so that top line of your water surface elevation, we had been saying, okay, on top of that water surface, we also need a foot of freeboard. So, and we'll talk a little bit about freeboard. So freeboard's basically our contingency plan because nature is hard to put to math. But so there's a little bit of buffer in these areas to account for the fact that it's not exact science. And so when we say freeboard, that's what that means. But we were asking for, from the water surface to the top of the spillway, which is like a bigger than 100-year storm event, another foot of freeboard. Basically, the gist is we were very conservative in terms of detention. Over a year ago, we sent an email out to the developer community and said, hey, we know this is the direction that our criteria is heading. If you want to apply these things and modify your detention to account for nested detention and decreased freeboard, you can do so. And so people have been applying that for quite some time, which decreased the size of their detention. So that's just something that we did early on before actually even publishing in November. The other, and feel free if anybody has any questions. Well, do you guys have any questions before I keep going? Yeah.
Just, so, for example, Majestic, I know, had the issue with the width, I guess, of the detention that they had to do. And was that an example of where they were able to reduce it?
So Majestic is interesting. So Majestic, so a couple of things about Majestic. So they basically are on like historically grazed farmland. And what happened is that the historic drainage pattern then was very wide and flat because of how that historically had been used. And what Majestic wanted to do is what historically had been done in the 80s and 90s, is decrease the channel to something tiny and make it a hardened surface. And what we've done is somewhere in between, where we've said, we need to evaluate what, before this farmland was grazed, what is an actual shape of a channel that would have existed in nature, and account for the amount of water that's going to be coming through it. Now, we landed in a place with Majestic where we kind of went in between what ultimately they wanted and what ultimately nature would have looked like. But that's, so there's a few things going on in the Majestic property, which is a good example about how stormwater is a million layers of complex. But yes, part of the improvements that they're doing are to get it even smaller than kind of that nature width that we had been shooting for.
And I think from their perspective, obviously it decreases their ability to develop land. And then of course, the other thing is more cost. So glad we were able to work that out.
Yeah, and we do have a reimbursement in place with Majestic to reimburse them for some of the regional aspects of those costs. But that is the argument that we will hear and we will continue to hear is stormwater improvements that are on the surface require land to be dedicated to them in order for the system to function. And so what we've tried very hard to do is make it safe, but equitable and fair, right? So we've worked very hard to apply data as much as possible to as many places as possible to ensure that it's right-sized or sized appropriately, not overly conservative, but appropriately to make sure the system will function. So, yeah. And that kind of gets us to this whole impervious area values thing. So we talked a little bit about the different stages of development. So one of the other core things, we've got the NOAA Atlas rainfall. Here's how much rain's going to hit the ground. And then the other main factor to figure out how much water is going to flow off of any site is how many hard surfaces that you've got. And the numbers that were developed in the 80s, which is a lot of the numbers that the district had been using for a long time, were numbers, they were good numbers. What we have now that we didn't have even 14 years ago is GIS data. So we have the ability to, well, not that we didn't have GIS data then, but the ability now to, what we were able to do is take the city and find I think probably a dozen, and I'll have to go back and look, but I think it's at least a dozen residential, commercial, and industrial properties. And we can very quickly say, okay, based on this area, what is the amount of hard surface versus non-hard surface in that area? So we can calculate those things. And we didn't have that ability to do that before. So that is one thing that we've done. And and actually these maps show that a little bit more, because that functionality exists. We just have a way to be more accurate than we were before. Now, what that did is some numbers went up and some numbers went down. because in the commercial and industrial areas, we assumed higher percentages, but there are actually a lot more green spaces and landscape buffers that we hadn't been accounting for in that previous data that now we can capture. So so this is kind of the comparison from a master plan. Now this is again that high level master plan schematic level information. So as an example, so commercial properties, oh, I have to move this thing off here. Put that down there. Okay, so the commercial properties. So this is an example. Commercial areas, neighborhood areas. In our previous manual, neighborhood areas wasn't really defined, so nobody really knew what it was or how to apply it. But so commercial areas were generally just 95%. Now what we've done is now we have very specific definitions to say what low, medium, and to high density commercial areas are, and then what urban core commercial means. And you'll notice that all those numbers are less than 95%. And those are based on actual calculations of impervious area data here in the city. When you, there you go. So residential, and this is also similar. So what we did with residential is developers think and talk in dwelling units per acre, right? That's how they do their business pro forma. That's how they do their planning. So we modified these so that they are also in dwelling units per acre, and they're a little bit easier to apply. And what you'll notice is that these don't change much. This asterisk for single family here represents about 55%. The reason it's an asterisk is because they used to do a different methodology to apply C factors and all these things, but generally that's about 55%. And you'll see that low to medium density residential, like residential used to be, single family used to be, is still in that 55% range. But now what we're capturing are some of these higher density, more dwelling units per acre percentages for multifamily. Let's see. Did a little too much animation. Industrial, here's another example where those numbers went down. So heavy and light industrial, 90 and 80% are now down at 75%, 65% for office and institutional. So those numbers decreased. Parks and open space stayed about the same, but we did include more data for what types of parks and open space that we are requiring here in the city to make it more straightforward and clear. Now, this is the one that you have probably heard more about, and we'll hear more about, because this is really where the impact is, but the impact is not for the reason people think. So paved streets actually have gone down a little bit. So from 100%, most people across the district use 95, so we converted to that. Similarly, concrete drives and walks, those stayed about the same. Rooftops, those did go up a little bit, again, to be consistent with what other folks are doing. We added a little more specificity to gravel, whether it's gravel that's not traveled on versus gravel that's basically used as a driveway or parking lot, because we do have to account for that. That will create more runoff. The big shift that is creating impacts in primarily residential based developments is this one. So, and I think everybody thinks that this number changed because of our conversion to xeric. And the reality is that first concept of, okay, xeric is probably going to create more stormwater runoff, was the first thing to actually trigger our deep dive into all of these impervious area numbers. But the reality is that that's not the reason that the numbers went up. So as an example, historically, what used to be used were the lawns were for sandy soils 2% and clay soils 5%. And a couple of things that kind of came to our attention when we really started thinking through this is native grasses, undisturbed native grasses, plains, like all the stuff on the outside of Seam out here, is 5%. So 2% already is an underestimation for a developed area for lawn. The other thing that we the connection that we made was, as you guys are very familiar with lawn irrigation return flows, And the amount of water that we can capture for water rights that come off of our lawns after we water them, and everyone who waters their lawns sees with just a little amount of rain, of sprinkled water, right? You can see how much water runs into your gutter. So the average lawn irrigation return flow is around 15%. And so we know these numbers are not accurate, and we know they're too low. So when we first started going down this path, we were trying to figure out what xeric runoff was, and the only data that we could find that was published was in Arizona. Now, the Arizona numbers are in the 80 to 90% range for xeric runoff, and we know there's a bunch of differences there. And so when we first started heading down this path, we're like, well, maybe it's closer to 60. And then we started going down a path of, okay, well, gravel with or without weed barrier is going to be different than mulch with or without weed barrier. So we started down this path of all of these different line items. And then pretty soon it was like, hey, we're not going to know, you know, how people are going to do their lawn. And B, we don't have any way to enforce it if they assume and estimate something at the civil plan level. So we took all the different data points and came together, and that's where the 20% came from. It's a little bit higher than the lawn irrigation return flow. It's lower than gravel. We know mulch is going to be in there. We know you're going to have plant material, or they're going to have plant material. So 20% was a number that felt reasonable, but completely honestly, it is not it's not a conservative number. But it did feel like an appropriate number to use for landscaping overall to account for all of the varieties. Now, as you can imagine, changing from that 5 or 2% that historically had been used to 20% for a fully residential development is going to have an impact. The reality of it is it's an actual impact. It's more stormwater runoff that we had not been accounting for before, and we can't not account for it. So what we've been doing is going through and having proactive meeting, and this gets to the grandfathering. Oops, I think I've got a bunch of animations. Okay, only one. So this is where the policy the policy comes in. We've got so many developers who are in progress right now. We've got approved master plans, we've got site plans, we've got civil plans that are going, and so what we've been trying to figure out is how do we now take the real information that we know and apply it and make sure that it's being accounted for without making everyone redo everything they've done over the last 10 years. So what the approach that we've done is we've met with each one of the different developers. We actually have a couple, we've got one later today, we've got one tomorrow. We've had several over the last number of weeks to say, bring us your overall plan. Show us what has been constructed, what is in civil plans, what's in site plan stage, what's in master planning stage. And then we're talking through that with each of them to say, okay, here's where we need, these sites are too far gone. We're going to have to let them go. And these areas we are going to evaluate, we would like to evaluate. And not necessarily to say you have to follow everything to the T that's in the policy manual, but what we're saying is apply the impervious area percentages that we have more confidence in, and show us how it reacts in the system. Show us, you know, how if the channels are overflowing, if detention is overflowing, how big the detention needs to be. You know, because as we mentioned, there are a number of places where we have buffers because it's not an exact science. So like as an example, in pipe networks, we allow 80% full. But if they apply those new numbers and they come back and they say, okay, now the pipes are showing 95% full, we're like, fine, right? Or if they're saying, you know, we had 2 foot of freeboard in our channel and now we only have 9 inches of freeboard, fine. If they apply those new percentages and they come back to us and we say, they're saying, okay, now we're 2 inches underneath somebody's finished floor elevation, probably not okay, right? We need to then take a look and say, okay, what is the risk after you've applied this new information? And we'll figure out how to work with you in areas that we can allow for some variances. So that's, yeah.
just because I've had so many issues with drainage in Southeast Aurora. So by putting the number at 20%, what is the actual effect to mitigating that? Does that mean more inlets, more storm drains? Because of all the inspections, hundreds that Terry von Klossberg has had to do in my area, we get complaints from residents with all this water flowing that the developers are like, you know, well, we can't account for all of that, and we don't know necessarily what's going to happen on plans versus when the homes are actually there and the water usage and so forth. So does that mean they would have to put in more inlets and more storm, whatever they're called, storm drains?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Get rid of the water, because I'm
Right.
just like, I'm going to probably have to ask for the Chase Drain rebate program, and I can never get a good answer on the overall development and how it affects its water flow. And I don't know if it's topography, the impervious things, or what's causing all these issues in my area.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So yes, in certain situations, it will require more inlets, larger pipes, more detention to account for that increase of stormwater flow. Part of what we are trying to address in both the criteria manual and the review process is how the stormwater comes off of a site, goes across or under a sidewalk into the street. The reality of it is that there's a couple different ways we're looking at it. So I think some of the things you're talking about are the storm events that happen more frequently and are smaller storm events. A lot of what we're talking about in this space is 100-year storm events. So massive storm events to make sure that people don't get flooded, or their properties don't get flooded, or there aren't unsafe conditions on roadways. But yes, there are parts of the criteria manual that try to address and help with what would be considered kind of nuisance or smaller storm flows to help better shift those into the parts of the system to create less issues.
And
so that is
there's
part of
no
what we're
software. Is there software out there that can, like, let's say a developer has his master plan and it shows whatever small lots with a mix of single family and multifamily. Is there software out there that can actually start to take all this stuff, all these numbers, and illustrate water flow?
Yeah, there are. So there's a number of them. There's about 4 different software packages that they'll use at different levels, but there is what's called 2D stormwater modeling now, which has started in the last few years. I mean, it's been there for a while, but it's becoming more prevalent, and the ability to use it where they can model exactly how stormwater is functioning. It's not necessarily used for small storm events in neighborhoods yet. It's more used for flat areas, previously developed areas in combination with new areas for large storm events when they don't know exactly where the stormwater is going to go. But yes, there continue to be evolutions of that ability to analyze things at that level. That level isn't being applied for small storm events yet, but we do look at how the stormwater flows off of sites in the stormwater network at the level that you're talking about.
Okay, all right, thank you.
The other thing to keep in mind though with the software or the models is they're only as good as the assumptions that go into the modeling. So Sarah mentioned the NOAA rain forecast. Those are assumptions. The subsurface details vary, and this is one of the challenges, especially in South Aurora, is there are clay lenses all over the place and they're not contiguous. Nobody goes in and maps those exactly. So when you model what will likely happen or what you think will happen, there's not enough refinement in the data to be exact. So it's not an exact science, and that's probably a little bit of what you're hearing from the developers, that, hey, it's a little different when we evaluate it up front and when we do our planning compared to what shows up in real life, because there's not the refinement in the data to be precise, and there probably never will be enough to be precise or exact. The goal is to be close and to minimize risk.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. So if there are any other questions about, if anybody, comes to you with questions, or if you have more questions about this as we continue to work with the development community on new criteria, then certainly, happy to reach out and answer questions. We have been trying to be very proactive to help them continue to move forward, but also make sure that we're evaluating risk. So.
Further questions, Councilmember Bergan?
No, I mean, it obviously was not done in whatever since 2010, so it needed to be done. And I think you're looking at new standards, but also some flexibility because of all the factors that are involved and maybe not so predictable. So I'm glad to hear you're working with the development community and getting their feedback.
Yeah, great, thank you.
It's an interesting science in hydrology here. And to hear that government is actually simplifying verbiage is positive. Nice job. And the extreme rainfall that we had, was it in May, June last year, which brought us out of that drought status? You could tell overall, by and large, that the storm drainage around the city seemed to work pretty well. That was a good test.
For sure. Yeah.
And I know, with the exception of Cherry Creek State Park, that road on the southern side got completely washed out in a couple of big spots, but it seems like things have been working pretty well based on the science behind it, and design and structure.
Yeah, which is encouraging. I think, and those are kind of back to what Marshall was saying, when we have storm events like that, which was about a 50-year storm event, just to give kind of a perspective, it's about half as big of a storm event as we plan for infrastructure. Then yeah, it gives us a good sense of where our system is at and how it's functioning. So that's great. I mean, it's okay if we don't get a ton of those, but.
I grew up in Fort Collins, and I guess it was the mid-90s, they had about a 100-year storm. And there are certain factors, and it really impacted quite a few people, and there were some deaths. There was, for example, a trailer park, which was bordered by a raised railroad. And that railroad acted as a dam, channeling a lot of water towards this trailer park unintentionally, right? And so there's a lot of factors to consider.
Yeah, I remember that. That's actually, so one of the reasons, as we've been talking about the Highline Canal, I know there's a lot of jurisdictions that have been intentionally putting stormwater in the canal to keep the trees alive and what have you. We do have an area actually on the downstream side of Aurora along the Highline Canal that is a big berm on the Highline Canal, and just on the other side of it is a similar home park. And so one of the reasons why we're pretty consistent in that we are not heading maybe that same direction as some of those other jurisdictions, but every time we're in that space or thinking about that, that's certainly, I think about that happened in Fort Collins that many years ago. Yeah.
Gotcha. Nice job, Sarah. Thank you. Question regarding the conservation ordinance that we did and the new requirements for front yards. if we're honest, did we have an unintended consequence based on drainage issues there, where now builders might have to build larger retention ponds? And was there some miscalculating that happened there?
No, Sarah talked a little bit about some of those discussions, so you will hear some people who might make that argument. In reality, what happened was it encouraged us to look more closely at the criteria and highlighted the fact that the impervious number for turf was way off. So in correcting the turf, essentially percolation number, that's what caused the impact. Because the turf, there's no way that bluegrass lawns are absorbing 98% of the rainfall. They might be absorbing 20%, and that's where Sarah said where we landed probably isn't overly conservative. It's much more of a realistic number now. But the problem is that the number that was in there before, the assumption that was in the manual historically, was way off. And that's what got highlighted through the process. And so it would have probably been highlighted whether we did the conservation ordinance or not. But because of the timing, you'll have some people blaming the conservation ordinance, when in reality, that's not what caused the change.
But also the soil, right? Like you said, clay
Well,
soil.
that's part of
So
the
if you have grass
problem.
on top of clay,
Yeah, there's two problems with the turf, right? One is the clay soils underlying most of Aurora underneath the turf aren't going to take the water, even if it gets through the turf. And the second challenge is people irrigate their lawns anyway, so they're saturated already. So they don't have capacity. Even if it wasn't clay underneath, you're probably not going to have, well, you're definitely not going to have 98% capacity to absorb the rainfall. You might have a little more than 80 if it wasn't clay, but those are the two compounding issues. Is the porosity is already taken up because people irrigate, and so it eliminates the capacity that was there. And two, even if that capacity were there, you've got clay underlying the soil amendments that we require to go in. So anyway, now there's a realistic number in there, but it has changed the calculations for how much runoff is hitting our system. It's much more accurate now, but change is difficult for people, even if it's well justified. So there are some who've gotten frustrated and said, "Oh, conservation ordinance." That's not what happened. We just fixed the turf impermeable number to be realistic, and that's what caused the change.
but I have a question on if by reducing the square footage, for example, in backyard, are people putting in much more hard surfaces to accommodate for that, such as, stamped concrete or whatever? And so now you've got impervious surfaces that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I look at it, which is a little different maybe than some others, but if those are localized, so if people put a barbecue pit in and take up 10% of their backyard area landscaping with that hard surface, it's not really going to make much difference, because again, you go to the clay soil, right? So the soils around the hard surface will still take a similar amount of water as long as the impervious surface doesn't get too big.
Well, yeah,
So
but if they're doing 50% of their yard.
Now, if they're doing 50% of their yard, if they're doing huge percentages, then it could have some impact. But you also have to consider if neighbor one does 50% of their yard and the 10 adjacent neighbors don't hardscape any of their yard, it's still not going to have an impact. So it's kind of again, it's not exact, but the capacity of the soils is still going to be similar, and it's going to be generally limited by the clay lenses that are down there. And so we see that again in South Aurora a lot, because there's more topography there, so it shows up a little more. You'll see areas that are totally hardscape, so streets, sidewalks, and you'll see water shooting out of cracks in some of those areas, because what's happening is the permeable areas are absorbing the water, and then it's hitting the clay, and then it's moving vertically, and it's going path of least resistance, so it's going downhill, and then it's shooting out of cracks in sidewalks or streets, and so that happens all over the place. Just kind of illustrating what you're talking about, or the question you had, where localized impervious surfaces are not probably going to change much. And so I think the direction they took of saying, look, all landscaped areas, we're going to consider 20%, a 20% factor, is a good direction. We probably, even if we tried, or if people told you they could get more accurate, it's probably not realistic.
Very interesting.
That is interesting science. Thank you. So here we are to miscellaneous matters. Councilmember Bergan, any miscellaneous matters you'd like to bring up?
No, I think I did earlier, just the WISE presentation somewhere down.
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to hear about that too. Marshall, Sarah, any miscellaneous matters? Anyone? Greg?
I don't think so. We'll, any other topics or agenda items you would like to see, just please let us know.
I have one.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if we have a really defined program, and we met and we discussed this in the past, but turf conversions around the city, intentional little areas in which we can take away thirsty grass and put ornamental things in there that make sense. Any progress on that and intentionality with that? It's probably something we partner with pros on, I'm sure. From time to time.
We had Brooke and I met the other day on that specifically. So yeah, we'll bring that back. There's some plan that's kind of been put together, but we need to refine it. So we'll get it refined, we'll bring it back, and we'll walk the committee through that as well.
Good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, our next meeting will be a month from now, Wednesday, February 21st at 10:30 a.m. And with that, thanks everyone. Have a great day. And I think it's 83 degrees where I'm at.
Safe travel.
Rubbing it in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Don't
everyone.
stay. Come back.
Yeah, don't stay.
It's kind of easier to work remote though,
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Sorry. That's great. You should
Thank you. No, I'm glad to. Sometimes
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't know if Will's talked to you. Now we're having some issues on the other side. So, yeah.